Let's get the conference started, shall we? So, I have the pleasure of introducing today's opening keynote speaker. He's a best-selling author, international lecturer, motivational speaker, 9/11 survivor. And to quote Larry King, Michael Hingson is an international hero honored and awarded by top organizations worldwide. Today, Michael's talk is Turning the Tables on Terror in Our Lives, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Michael Hingson. Michael, over to you.
Resilience. I guess that's what we're supposed to talk about. Let me start this way. How many of you know somebody who is blind? How many of you think a blind person can be resilient? And how many of you think it's a bright idea that when a blind speaker asks you a question, you should respond by raising your hands? And so now that we did that, we can pick on Alex. Alex said earlier, sorry you virtual people didn't hear this, but he said that this room is being divided into two rooms. One is the, when we go to break, one is the Warwick room and one is the Salisbury room. He said one is over here, one is over there, and that doesn't tell me a single solitary thing. And the reason I mention that is not to pick on Alex too much, but rather to say that resilience is something that we all need to share, and we all need to help everyone prepare for. And we need to eliminate our misconceptions and poor attitudes about people who are different than us, especially those who happen to have disabilities, or we say they have disabilities, because unfortunately, unlike what most people really understand, disability does not mean a lack of ability. Disability is a characteristic that we all have. Want me to prove it? I will. Last year, I went to a hotel, and I was there with my niece and nephew, and while we were coming down the stairs after putting our luggage in our room, and our luggage was going into a room on the third floor, and it was a main set of stairs going down from there to the first floor. Suddenly I heard a bunch of people screaming down on the first floor, and I asked my niece, what's going on? And she said, we just lost power in and around the hotel. Well, okay, that's fine. Didn't bother me a bit, but all those people on the first floor with windows all around them with lots of sunlight coming in were panicking because they lost the lighting that they were used to. The problem is, all y'all, as we would say in Texas if I lived there, you people are light dependent whether you like it or not, and that is as much a disability as being light independent or blind. Why? Because the reality is without light, you guys don't do a lick of good at all. And the fact is that Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb back in 1878, which is fine, and what the light bulb did was to create a mechanism to provide, as we would say with the Americans with Disabilities Act or the new rules and regulations coming in the EU, it's a way to provide light on demand for light-dependent people whenever they need it. So light covers up your disability, but make no mistake, the disability is still there, as evidenced by when you lose power and the light goes out and you don't immediately have something that just comes on. You don't get the answer and the opportunity to see like you want to. Everyone in this world, everyone on this planet has some sort of a disability. Disability is not a lack of ability. Disability is a characteristic that every single person has, except that we manifest it in different ways. So every one of you has the disability of light dependence, whether you like it or not, and whether you want to admit it or not, but it's there. And that means you need to learn how to have resilience in a light independent world, but you don't, because the electric light has covered up your disability so much. When I was born back in 1950, you do the math, you know how old I am now. When I was born, and it was discovered 4 months later that I was blind, the doctors told my parents to send me to a home for handicapped children because no blind child could ever grow up to amount to anything or be able to contribute in any way to society. That's what they told my parents. And you know what? It still happens today. Because all too many people think that without eyesight, you're not human, you're not normal, you are not as capable as people with eyesight. My response is, bah humbug, balderdash, ain't true. The reality is, it's what you learn. Blindness doesn't define me, it's how I function, how I act, and what I've learned that counts. My parents told the doctors, you all are wrong, he can grow up to do whatever he wants, and they brought me up believing that. So I guess that's another way of saying that my parents brought me up to be resilient by any standard. I grew up learning how to function. I grew up when we moved to California from Chicago, where I was born. When we moved at the age of 5, a couple of years later, I started riding a bike. I rode a bike to school. I can do that. I can hear. I can hear when there are cars parked on the sides of the streets. I can hear when there are cars coming at me or from behind me. I can move out of the way. Otherwise, I might have a problem because they're bigger than I am and they're going to run me down. But the fact of the matter is, I could learn all of that and did learn all of that. I was very interested in science, and so when I went to college at the University of California at Irvine, go anteaters, when I went to the University of California at Irvine, I obtained a master's degree in physics and a secondary teaching credential. One of the most important things I learned when I went to UC Irvine, and a lot of professors pointed this out to people in their classes on a regular basis, pay attention to the details. So for example, they would tell you it isn't enough to get the numbers right when you're doing a mathematical calculation in physics. You also have to make sure that you get things like the units right. So if you get 10, but you don't get meters per second squared, then you're not dealing with acceleration or you screwed up in the math somewhere. You have to be able to address it. Pay attention to the details. And that is something that all too often we just take for granted. For me, I like to pay attention to details. I like information. Along the way, I was hired by the National Federation of the Blind, the largest organization of blind consumers in the country, in the United States, and in fact the world. I was hired to be part of a project. A guy named Ray Kurzweil, some of you may have heard of him, he's invented this concept called the singularity. Ray came along and he said, I've got a machine that literally will read print out loud. And I want to be able to use that machine in some meaningful ways. So the first way I'm going to use it is to provide technology so a blind person could read print. And he did. But the problem is he couldn't get funding. So he came to blind people and he said, can you help? We actually created a project where 5 of the machines were purchased at $50,000 each. If anybody wants one, I can get one for $49,900 for you. But 5 of the machines were purchased and they were put around the country. And my job literally for 18 months was to live out of suitcases in hotels, traveling all over the country, teaching people to use the machines, teaching people how to train others to use the machines, repairing machines sometimes when they were necessary. And this is all bleeding edge technology by any standard. But I learned how to do that. In 1976, in October, I flew to Boston, Massachusetts from my home in California. Never been to Boston before. No one went with me. No one needed to go with me. But I needed to do that to work in his laboratory, in Ray's lab, and then later in other places around the United States to do the things that we needed to do to finally create a report with the final recommendations for Ray as to what needed to go into the final first production model of the machine. I then went to work for Ray, and after 9 months, I was going to be laid off because I was not a revenue producer for this engineering startup, and I was given the choice of being laid off or going into sales. Well, I decided I would lower my standards and go from science to sales, which I love to tell people. And so I went into sales, and the first thing I did was took a Dale Carnegie sales course. And in that Dale Carnegie sales course, I learned a lot about what real sales is all about. I learned that salespeople who are really good are teachers, are guidance people, they counsel. Well, I wanted to, and I had a secondary teaching credential, I wanted to teach, so I took advantage of that in sales. I learned other things along the way. But in 1984, Xerox bought the company and laid off all of us who were in sales. And I wasn't even selling the reading machine at the time. I was selling a more commercial version, which was only $125,000. I probably can still find one for $124,900 if anybody wants it. But The bottom line is that I sold this product in the eastern part of the United States, in the Northeast actually, and throughout Canada. Never been to Canada before, and suddenly I was going to Canada on a regular basis. Didn't matter. Blindness wasn't the problem. I decided I could do it, and so I did. Is that resilience? I guess it is. So in 1984, however, Xerox laid off all of the salespeople, and I was the last to be laid off because they didn't want the people, they just wanted the technology. By that time, I had been married 2 years to a woman named Karen Ashurst, who became Karen Hingson. Karen was a lady in a wheelchair. She had been in a chair her whole life. And we worked together. I couldn't get a job, so I started my own company selling computer-aided design systems to architects. CAD systems? A blind guy selling CAD systems? Why not? Didn't matter that I couldn't see it. What I needed to know was how to work the machine so I could describe it to other people rather than sitting in front of the machine. And by the way, I don't really do slides. I think there are a couple of slides that I was told were going to be put up, and I'll talk about the second one in a minute. I tend not to do slides because I like people to listen rather than focusing on all sorts of other stuff. Why have slides in the speaker? Because if people focus on the slides, they don't hear the speaker. Because most of you guys don't multitask as well as you think you do. Just saying. By the way, picking on Alex and other people again, I was asked, how are you going to know when it's time for your presentation to be over? Because you've got to talk for 35 minutes and then leave time for questions and answers. And they said speakers usually get to see a sign that says when your time is almost up. Well, let me just tell you, we're going to have a religious miracle here or a very long speech because I'm speaking until I see the sign. Just saying. I'm such a big, resilient help, aren't I? Anyway, so I did that for the CAD system for 4 years and then went back into the workforce. When I was looking for a job, I always have a debate. Blind people always have a debate. Do we say in our resume cover letter we're blind or not? Because typically if we don't say we are blind, we might get called for an interview, but then when we arrive, the defenses all go up. Oh my God, you're blind. How are you going to get to work? How are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? It doesn't matter what the resume shows. If I do say I'm blind, I won't even get a call back. Well, I was talking to my wife and she said, one of the things that you always told people who you hired, because I was in sales and sales management and so on, one of the things that you always told people was the most important thing you learned in your Dale Carnegie sales course was turn, here it comes, perceived liabilities into assets. What is blindness? It is not a liability, it is a perceived liability by people who don't know anything about blindness because they're light dependent. The reality is, again, blindness isn't the problem. I went off and I wrote a cover letter for that resume that I sent to this company, and the last 2 paragraphs went something like this. It's important for you to hear this. The most important thing you need to know about me when you're considering my job for this resume is that I am blind. As a blind person, I have had to sell, it was a sales position, I've had to sell all of my life just to be able to get anything done. I've had to sell to convince people to let me buy a house. I've had to sell to convince people to let me take my guide dog on airplanes, into apartments, into grocery stores. So, second paragraph, when you're hiring somebody for this job, do you want to hire somebody who just comes in for 8 or 10 hours a day and then goes home because the job is over? Or do you want to hire somebody who truly understands sales for the science and art that it is and who sells 24 hours a day as a way of life? That's the letter that I sent. And 2 weeks later, I got a call and was asked to come down on the 3rd of July for an interview. I went down, and that day I was hired. If you're ever going to get hired for a job and you're in the U.S., get hired on the 3rd of July because the next day, the 4th, is a holiday. It's great. Anyway, I got the job, and I did it for a number of years, including in 1996. I was asked to relocate to the East Coast because I was selling to the East Coast from the West Coast, and I was asked to relocate in order to better serve the New York Wall Street environment. And so we moved, my wife and I, to actually New Jersey, and then I went into New York every day to work and function and sell. The job was on the 23rd floor of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center, and I had the job from 1996 until May of 1997 when I was recruited away by a company And then 2 years later, I was recruited away by another company. And in both cases, they asked me to open offices for them in New York. So I guess I became an office opening kind of person. I thought I was in sales, but I guess that's part of it. Anyway, 1999, I was recruited away by Quantum Corporation, which was at that time a Fortune 500 company, quite resilient in its own way, because it is the company that manufactured and sold products that people used to back up all of their data on computer networks and would then take that data on magnetic tape and store it off-site. We were the de facto standards, the developer of the digital linear tape at that time, high-density tape, and the libraries to go with it. I opened the office in the World Trade Center on August 1st, 2000. In August of 2001, I was asked to conduct seminars for some of our reseller partners, which I did. And the point of doing that was we wanted to teach them how to sell the products to leverage our sales and get more sales. I contacted a person in our office, David Frank, who was the guy who was in charge of distribution and dealer pricing, and he wanted to come back and be part of the seminar. I would do the main part, being a technical guy, and definitely technical in every sense of the word. My salespeople kept saying, how come you know so much about our products technically? And I said, did you read the bulletin that came out last week? Well, no, I was too busy, I didn't have time. And I said, there you go, you lose out. But that's what I did. Remember what I said earlier? Paid attention to the details. Another thing that I did, working in the World Trade Center when I first went in and opened this new office, was spent a lot of time walking around the World Trade Center, typically using a white cane rather than my guide dog, because a dog, like a cane, doesn't know where I want to go and how to get there. Dogs don't lead blind people. What dogs do is they make sure we walk safely, which is what they're supposed to do. I'm supposed to know where to go and how to get there. And I know that because I learned where to go and how to get there. So I walked all around the World Trade Center, typically using a cane, learned where all the kiosks and all the sales things were in the first floor shopping center, learned which was an area between the towers of the World Trade Center at that time. I learned where the shoe shine stand was so I could go get shoes polished on a regular basis, and other things that I needed to know. I literally learned everything I could about the World Trade Center, consulted with the Port Authority security people, the fire department, the fire marshals, the police. I learned everything I could because as the leader of that office, I needed to know that stuff. Oh yeah, most of you just rely on signs. That works until you're in a room filled with smoke, by the way. So relying on signs isn't the way to go for you light-dependent people. Learn, get the information, know it firsthand. That's extremely important. And that's what I did. Why is that relevant? Because on September 11th, 2001, we were going to hold the seminars that we were arranging. And at 8:45 in the morning, I was reaching for letterhead because the last thing we needed to do was to provide for the Port Authority security people a list of all the attendees for the seminars. And we needed to do it on letterhead that we faxed to them. I was reaching for letterhead when suddenly we heard a muffled kind of thud and explosion. And then the building, as I'm tipping my hand toward you now, the building began to tip. And it tipped and it tipped. We may have moved like about 20 feet. David and I were in my office. We had some early arrivals who were in our conference room eating breakfast. We had ordered breakfast for them. And David and I were in there, and I said, gee, maybe this was an explosion as the building was tipping. David said, didn't really sound like it. Maybe it's an earthquake. And I said, no, it's not an earthquake. David was from New York. He didn't live in California long. I lived on the San Andreas Fault. I knew that buildings jiggled around in earthquakes. I said, no, it's not an earthquake. Anyway, the building kept moving. I went over and stood in the doorway to my office while the building continued to tip. And finally, David and I said goodbye to each other because we thought we were about to take a 78-floor plunge to the street below. Then the building slowed down and it stopped and it started moving back the other way. And finally, it became vertical again. And as soon as it did, I went back into my office and I met my guide dog, my fifth guide dog, Roselle, coming out from under my desk. I took her leash. I told her to heel, which meant to come around on my left side and sit, which she did. And about that time, the building dropped straight down about 6 feet. Why did it drop down 6 feet? It dropped down 6 feet because tall buildings like that are made with expansion joints. They're made literally to be able to be hit by an airplane. Oh, nobody thought that an airplane with 26,000 pounds of jet fuel was going to hit the building, but they're made to be hit, and they're made to be flexible in windstorms and so on, so they can be buffeted around. And the building tipped, the expansion joints expanded. When the building got vertical, the expansion joints went back down to their normal configuration. I knew all that because I had asked questions about the towers. I asked all I could, and I learned about these expansion joint things. And when the building stopped moving, I was holding my dog's leash. David turned around and looked out the window and started shouting, "Oh my God, Mike, there's fire and smoke above us. There are millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside the window." I could hear things falling outside the window. Now I knew what they were, millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside the window. David said, "We got to get out of here right now." And I kept saying, "Slow down, David, we will." "No, we got to get out of here right now. We can't stay here." "No, slow down, David, we'll get out." "No, we got to get out of here right now." And then finally he used the big line, as I call it. "You don't understand. You can't see it." How quickly people revert to type. It doesn't matter how well they know someone, they revert to type. You don't understand, you can't see it. Now, I understand there are a lot of blind people who may not pay attention to details that they should. There's certainly lots of sighted people who don't pay attention to details that they should. But the bottom line that for me, a mindset had clicked in because I had learned all of this stuff firsthand from the people who knew. And that told me that whatever was going on, we weren't in such imminent danger. Why did I know that? Because sitting next to me was a dog wagging her tail and yawning and being bored and going, "Who woke me up? I was sleeping real good here, Mike." And I knew what Roselle was like when she was afraid because she's afraid of thunderstorms. But she wasn't indicating fear. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't panting. She was just sitting there wagging her tail and yawning, going, "Who woke me up?" And so I knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't such an imminent emergency that we didn't have the opportunity to try to evacuate in an orderly way. And I finally, when David used the big line, "You don't understand, you can't see it," I just told him, "Stop, David. We'll get out of here, but we're going to do it in an orderly way." And I finally got him to focus, and I said, "Get our guests to the elevators," because we had early arrivals. Don't let them take the elevators, get them to the stairs. Because if there's fire in the elevators, because you saw fire, and if it's in the elevators, they're going to die if they're in the elevators. Don't let them take elevators, take stairs. I learned that from the fire people. Emergencies, don't take elevators. So David took people to the stairs. I called my wife Karen in New Jersey, told her that there had been an explosion or something and that we were leaving. She wanted to know more. The media hadn't gotten the story yet, but I told her I'll call her as soon as I could, and then I hung up. David came back, we swept the offices, and we went to the stairs and we started down. Almost immediately I began smelling an odor, and it was familiar. I knew it was something. It took me about 4 floors to realize that I was smelling the same thing that I smelled whenever we were at airports, all the burning kerosene, burning jet fuel. And I observed others around me. "I'm smelling burning jet fuel." And they went, "Yeah, we were trying to figure out what it is. We must have been hit by an airplane." Look, understand, no one on the stairs knew what happened. People say to me all the time, "Well, of course, you're blind. You didn't understand it." Excuse me. The last time I checked, Superman and X-ray vision are fiction, right? The airplane hit 18 floors above us on the other side of the building. The last time I checked, nobody could see through rebarb, 18 floors of steel and concrete and so on. No one knew what was going on. But for me, a mindset had kicked in that said, you know what to do in an emergency. Focus. Yeah, something could have happened, like the building could have come down all around us, and that would have been a different story. And you've been hearing this presentation probably in a more spiritual way than we're doing it now. But nevertheless, I knew what to do in an emergency because I had learned it. And so when we figured out an airplane hit the building, we kept walking down the stairs. At about the 10th floor, a woman behind me stopped and she said, "I can't breathe, I can't go on, we're not going to make it out of here." And I turned around to her, other people joined in, Roselle joined in, we gave her a group hug, Roselle gave her kisses, and we said, "Come on, you can do this, let's go down the stairs together." And she was able to do that. A number of us instinctively knew we didn't dare allow panic to take over on the stairs because then none of us would have made it out. We got to about the 50th floor, and suddenly David, who had grown pretty quiet, said, "Mike, we're going to die. We're not going to make it out of here." And I just said in my best teacher voice yelling at students, "Stop it, David, if Roselle and I can go down these stairs, so can you." And he told me later that that brought him out of his funk, and I deliberately did it that way to make that happen. David then said, "I got to keep my mind off this. I'm going to walk, if it's okay with you, a floor below you and shout up to you what I see on the stairs." And I said, "Okay." Did I need him to do that? No. Would it have mattered? No. But nevertheless, that's what he felt he needed to do, and I thought it was fine. I mention it for a reason. So I got to the 48th floor, and David said, "Hey, I'm at the 47th floor, going down the stairs, all clear." I got to the 45th floor. There was a 46th floor in between, don't worry. Got to the 45th floor, and David said, "Hey, I'm at the 44th floor. This is where the Port Authority cafeteria is, not stopping, going on down." Why do I mention that? Because David, whether he understood it at the time or not, David became a focal point for anyone on the stairs who could hear him. Above him, below him, thousands of people heard, "Hey, Mike, I'm at the 43rd floor. All's good here, going down the stairs." He had to help keep panic from ensuing and happening on the stairs just by saying he was okay. Hundreds, thousands of people had to have heard him and knew that there was a place on the stairs where somebody was okay, which meant they'd probably be okay. So we kept going down the stairs, and finally I was on the 31st floor, and David said, "Hey, Mike, I'm on the 30th floor. Firefighters are coming up the stairs. People move to the side. Let them by." I went down to where he was, and I said, "What do you see?" And he said, "Well, they're not quite here yet, but they're coming." And they're carrying all sorts of stuff on their back, maybe 100 pounds. It was probably like about 60, 65 pounds of oxygen cylinders, supplies, fire axes, shovels, and so on. The first guy gets to me and he stops right in front of me. He wouldn't let me pass, and he goes, "Hey, buddy, you okay?" You know, that's how they talk back there in New York. You know what I'm saying? And I said, "I'm fine." "Well, that's really nice. We're going to send somebody down the stairs with you to make sure you get out." And I said, "You don't need to do that. I'm good." "Well, we're going to do it anyway." And I said, "You don't have to. I'll tell you why in a minute." But I kept saying, "You don't need to do that." I said, "I got my guide dog, Roselle, here." And he starts petting Roselle. It wasn't the time to give him a lecture. Don't pet a guide dog in harness. The dog is working. And by the way, if you ever see a person with a service dog like a guide dog, don't pet the dog. You can ask if you can pet the dog, and somebody may say yes, and somebody will say no. I will typically say no until I take the harness off, because the harness is the symbol that the dog's working. And again, remember, the dog doesn't lead the blind person. The job of a guide dog is to make sure I walk safely. It's my job to know where to go and how to get there. I don't want my dog to know where to go, because he's not going to remember, or she's not going to remember, all the different options. That's my job. My job is to direct the dog. The dog's job is to make sure that we go safely wherever I tell the dog to go. Anyway, it wasn't time to give him a lecture about the fact that the dog is in harness, and it wasn't the time to give him a lecture about the problem isn't blindness, it's your attitude and misconceptions about blindness. So I just said, "I got my friend David over here who can see. We're going down the stairs together." The guy turns to David, "You're with him?" David goes, "Yeah, he's fine. Leave him alone." He said, "Okay, we'll go up the stairs." And he pets Roselle one more time. Roselle gives him a couple kisses. Very possibly the last unconditional love that gentleman ever got in his life. I don't know, but very possibly. Anyway, he went on up the stairs, and we continued down the stairs. We got down to David reassuming his scouting position. He got to the first floor and said, "The water sprinklers are on. We're going to have to go through water to get out." And I said, "Okay," from up above him. And along the way, by the way, there was a place where people passed along water bottles because people were getting thirsty, and somebody had, as they said very politely, opened a water vending machine and got bottles of water for everybody. I wonder if they opened them or broke in. I've never known that. Anyway, the bottom line is that Roselle, David, and I shared a bottle. But anyway, so David said the sprinklers are on, and what they were doing was creating a curtain of water so fire couldn't get in or out of the stairwell if it broke out on either side of that barrier. David went through the barrier of water, and he was gone. I got to the first floor, heard this torrential downpour, picked up Roselle's harness and said, "Forward." We went through and came out the other side totally soaked and drenched into the lobby, and people were yelling through bullhorns, "Go this way. No, don't go outside. Don't go that way. Go this way. Don't go outside into the sunlight from here. Go elsewhere. Follow directions." We didn't know at the time that what was going on outside our doors was one of the places where people were jumping from up above. Learned that later. Anyway, so a guy came up to David and me and he said he was with the FBI and he would take us where we needed to go. And I said, what's going on? He wouldn't tell me. Now, do you get the impression by now I like information? But he wouldn't tell us. And I understand why he wouldn't. He didn't know whether I was going to panic or whatever. Anyway, he took us through the complex and we went up an escalator as far away from the towers as we can be, and we got outside at 9:45 in the morning. And when we got outside, David looked around and he said, Mike, there's fire in Tower 2. And I went, what are you talking about? And he said, there's fire. You sure? Yeah. We had no idea what had happened. We didn't feel anything when the plane hit. We didn't know anything about what had occurred other than now there was fire. We just thought maybe the fire had jumped across from our complex, our building. Anyway, we went over to Broadway. We turned left and walked north on Broadway. There was a building right to my left on the west side, and Broadway was on my right. We walked across several streets. We finally got to Vesey Street and stopped. David said, I can see Tower 2 really well now. We're close to it. I want to take pictures of the fire that I see up in the towers. And we stopped. I tried to call my wife, Karen. I couldn't get through because the circuits were busy. As I now know, people were saying goodbye to loved ones. I had just put my phone away and David was putting his camera away when suddenly a police officer yelled, get the hell out of here, it's coming down right now, get out of here. And we heard this rumble that became this deafening roar. I describe it as kind of a combination of a freight train and a waterfall. You could hear glass breaking and clattering, metal collapsing, and then the white noise of Tower 2 pancaking straight down like 100 yards away from us. Everyone turned and ran back the way they had come in all sorts of different directions. I turned Roselle around. David was gone. He ran. I turned Roselle 180 degrees and we started running back the way we came. We got to the next street. We turned right now on Fulton Street going west. I ran about 25 yards and caught up to David. Turns out we went the same way. And when we met each other, David apologized. I said, don't worry about it, David. Let's just keep going. The building's coming down. Debris was falling all around us. We ran. And then we were suddenly caught in the dust cloud, all the dirt and debris, all the stuff from Tower 2's collapse. We knew we had to get out of it, and so I started telling Roselle, right. Now there was a building on my right side, and I kept telling her to go right because I wanted her to go into the first entrance she could see, which would have gotten us out of all that dust and debris. And I was listening for an opening, and suddenly I heard an opening. I didn't know whether Roselle was able to hear me or see my hand signals or not, but she obviously was, because suddenly she turned right, she took one step, she stopped, and she wouldn't move. Come on, Roselle, keep going. She would not move. And I finally realized she must not be moving for a reason. I investigated, kind of ran my hand along a wall, stuck out a foot, and discovered we were at the top of a flight of stairs. Roselle had done her job perfectly. And so we walked down the stairs into the Fulton Street subway station, and with help from an employee of the subway system, I and David and about 7 or 8 other people joined others who were, in fact, in an employee locker room that this gentleman named Lou took us all to. And he said, you're okay here, there's water, kind of decompress and we'll go from there. We were there for a while when a police officer came and said, you got to get out of here right now. The air is clear up above, please leave. And so we went upstairs. David looked around and he said, oh my God, Mike, there's no Tower 2 anymore. And I said, what do you see? And he said, all I see are pillars of smoke hundreds of feet tall. We stood there and then we just walked west on Fulton Street. We walked a ways and then we heard that freight train waterfall sound again and we knew it was Tower 1 collapsing. We ducked down behind a retaining wall and we stayed there for a few minutes until all the noise had stopped. Then we got up and David looked around and he said, oh my God, Mike, there's no World Trade Center anymore. And I said again, what do you see? And he said, all I see are fingers of fire and flame, hundreds of feet tall and pillars of smoke. It's gone. No World Trade Center. We stood there a moment, and then I tried to call my wife Karen again, and this time I got through, and after tears on both sides of the phone, she told us how 2 aircraft had been deliberately crashed into the towers, 1 into the Pentagon, and a 4th was still missing over Pennsylvania at the time. To think we had gone in 3 hours before just to do our job, and then suddenly it was all gone. Why did I survive? I paid attention to details and was prepared. I like information. I know that having it and being appropriately and truly prepared makes a big difference. That is to say, adopting a lifestyle of true resilience makes a difference. And that's what I'm here to tell all of you today. You can do it. Don't just rely on eyesight. It's better to learn a lot more about how to function in an environment that may very well cause you as a person with eyesight to be able to function if you know what to do. Learn resilience. I'm here without my guide dog today because of some technicalities with the British Airport Authority and so on. No problem. I can use a white cane. I can still function. I'm in a hotel that doesn't have a single solitary Braille room number on any door. But I can make it work. It isn't the most convenient thing, but I can do it. I'm in an environment where so many things are not necessarily presented in an inclusive way. We should learn how to do that. Are your websites accessible? If they're not, something to look at, and I'd be glad to talk with you about that and help you with it. And that's my story, and that's what I really came to talk to you about. You'll see there were some slides. I think there's a QR code on one of the slides. I've written 3 books. The first is called Thunderdog, The True Story of a Blind Man and His Guide Dog and the Triumph of Trust at Ground Zero. It was a #1 New York Times best-selling book in 2011. I wrote a children's book called Running with Roselle. More adults buy it than kids, but I wrote another book earlier this year to talk to people about how to control fear using lessons I've learned from 8 guide dogs and my wife's service dog. It's called Live Like a Guide Dog, True Stories from a Blind Man and His Dogs about being brave, overcoming adversity, and moving forward in faith. But it's about how to learn to control fear. Yeah, we're always going to be afraid, but we can learn to control it rather than letting it, as I would say, blind or overwhelm us. And so there's a QR code that you can actually take a picture of and where you can go buy the book. It is on discount if you do it through this QR code through the end of November. So hopefully you will, and tell others to do it as well. And that's my story. I would also, and I want to take questions now, but I would also say I do this speaking now for a living. My wife and I were starting to get a lot of requests after September 11th, and we decided that if we could teach people how to deal with fear, how to deal with the World Trade Center and what happened, how to overcome and deal with tragedy and emergency in our lives, if I could teach them about blindness and guide dogs and so on, that was worth a whole lot more than selling computer hardware and technology. And so I do it full time, and I'm always looking for speaking opportunities. So if any of you need a speaker, love to talk with you about it. So now, having picked on Alex, what do we want to do for questions?
Well, first of all,
Thank you.
let's ask the room, is there anyone with a question for Michael?
If you raise your hands, he'll call on you, because I won't.
Raise
Look,
your hand and I'll
let
bring
me
the microphone
point
to you.
out to you, there is no question, period, that's off limits. I've been asked questions by the toughest interrogators in the world, and I don't mean the CIA, they're wimps. I've been asked questions by 3rd graders. I spoke to a class once of K through 6th grade, and this 3rd grader boy gets up, of course it was a guy, he gets up and his question was, how do blind people have sex? And my response was, the same way everyone else does, and if you want to know more, go ask your parents. I'm not dumb. So there is literally no question off limits, so please feel free.
So way over here.
Thanks, Michael. My name's David. As a group of alleged professionals in the room, I think the thing we struggle with the most is how do you define resilience? Is there some words where you would actually define resilience for us?
Well, I think resilience, I actually looked up the definition this morning. I can't argue with what I looked up. It talks about elasticity. It talks about being able to overcome and deal with change. I think resilience is all about really paying attention to the details and knowing things to the best that you can, and then trying to pass that on to other people. I think that's the other part about it for all of the people in this room and watching who are professionals. It isn't enough for you to be resilient. You need to teach others to truly be able to deal with whatever comes along, to learn that you can adopt a mindset that will allow you to get through with whatever happens. And I would also say this, look, I don't believe even to this day that we could have really totally predicted what happened on September 11th. I don't think that the reports that I've read even convinced me that it would be possible to have predicted that. What I do believe, however, is that in reality, all of us can learn that when things happen to us, even though we may not have control over them, we always, absolutely always have full control over how we deal with what happens to us. And we have to take the initiatives in our own minds to deal with that and to address that. Does that help?
Another question over here.
Hi, Michael. First of all, thank you for your story. It's really inspiring. And I'm also a David, so you've got two Davids straight away. One thing I want to ask is, what is your biggest fear?
I'm sorry,
What is your biggest fear?
what is my biggest fear is probably not getting enough information and always looking for more. Again, though, I'm not going to let any fear overwhelm me to the point where I can't function. So I know that there are a lot of times I'm not going to get information that I would like. And all I can do is keep looking for data, looking for more things so that I'm able to function. But I refuse to believe that as a person who is blind, that I can't function. I will always find ways to do the things that I need to do. But I do get very concerned about not getting data. When I first got here and discovered, for example, that there was no braille on the on the doors, I went, how am I going to find my room? Well, it turns out it's easy to get to the general location of my room from the lift, no problem. And then what I did was I got a piece of tape and wrapped the tape around the handle of the door to my room so I can find my room without any trouble. Thank you very much. You know, the reality is there's always a way.
And we've got one question from our virtual viewers, from Keely or Kylie, hopefully I'm saying
Or
that
Fred.
correctly.
Yes.
Do you work with children with blindness and support them in being brave and coping with their blindness and navigating the world?
The whole idea of coping with blindness is the issue. You're looking at it from a sighted person's perspective. I believe that the bigger problem is people coping with eyesight. But sure I do. And I also deal with people who can see. I deal with lots of kids, blind and not blind, and trying to help them understand that there are ways to do things. I'm the vice president of the board of directors of the Colorado Center for the Blind, which is an organization that provides a residential environment to teach blind people, especially who are newly blind, how to deal with being blind and developing a philosophy of blindness. And I'm also on other boards, but I travel and speak. Next week I will be in New York for a week speaking at a school district, talking to mostly students in 7th and 8th grade classes about blindness, the World Trade Center, and being resilient. And they're mostly going to be sighted kids. I'm sure there's going to be 1 or 2 blind kids in the group. But I don't focus just on blind people. I will do it wherever there's an opportunity to speak and help people understand that the reality is our biggest problems are the misconceptions that we have and the problems that we make for ourselves.
Great, we have 2 minutes left. Any one last question? Oh.
I still haven't seen the sign, by the way, so I can talk for a long time, but I'm just, hey, go ahead. The roving mic.
Can you hear me now? Oh, there you go. Really insightful. That was amazing. You've obviously lived through one disaster being the 9/11. How did you find life during the pandemic? What were the difficulties that you faced as someone who is blind? Because I work in the National Health Service here, and I think it's something we, as a service, don't do as well as we should do. So any sort of learning insight you had from how you dealt with the pandemic?
One of the biggest things that I found that was a challenge was finding and scheduling times to go get vaccines and injections when that became available, because the people who were creating the websites weren't being inclusive. And so it was very difficult for me to schedule an appointment. Zoom was great as a teleconference and video conferencing technology, because they created a whole accessibility team so that whenever anyone emailed them and said, we're having this problem with accessibility with Zoom, within a week it was fixed. So Zoom is the most accessible way I have found so far to really be able to do conferencing. And my wife and I locked down. She, as I said, was in a chair her whole life. She passed away in November of 2022. We were married 40 years. But she also had rheumatoid arthritis, and we just chose to lock down. So we worked from home and didn't travel. And it was okay because we liked each other and we talked a lot, and we read books together. So we did fine. But the biggest thing was when websites weren't accessible. I now work with a company called Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, that has a lot of different kinds of technologies, including some very inexpensive ones, that will help make websites a lot more inclusive and accessible. And if you go to Accessibe.com, you can actually do a free audit of your website to see how inaccessible it is. But if anybody wants to talk about that, I'd be glad to. I'm easy to find. You can email me at speaker@michaelhingson.com, speaker@michaelhingson.com. Website is www.michaelhingson.com. And Alex mentioned his podcast. I had the pleasure of being on his podcast about a month ago or a month and a half ago, but I told him it was going to cost him, and he had to also come on my podcast, which is Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. And we do 2 episodes a week. So if anybody would like to be a guest, like to talk about it, it's all about having conversations about people, about yourself, what you do, why you do what you do, and so on. Love to invite anyone who wants to come on to do it. And again, you can go to my website, michaelhingson.com/podcast, or just email me at speaker@michaelhingson.com, and we can make connections, and would love to have you on.
And on that, we've run out of time.
Can I end with one more thing? From Thunderdog, I want to end with something called Guide Dog Wisdoms, what I learned from Roselle on September 11th, and it goes like this. There's a time to play and a time to work. Know the difference. When the harness goes on, it's time to work. Work hard. Others are depending on you. Number 2, focus in and use all of your senses. Learn to tell the difference between a harmless thunderstorm and a true emergency. Don't let your sight get in the way of your vision. Number 3, sometimes the way is hard, but if you work together, someone will pass along a water bottle just when you need it. I mentioned that earlier. Number 4, Roselle's favorite, always kiss firefighters. Number 5, ignore distractions. There's more to life than playing fetch or chasing tennis balls. Number 6, listen carefully to those who are wiser and more experienced than you. They'll help you find the way. Number 7, don't stop until work is over. Sometimes being a hero is just doing your job. Number 8, the dust cloud won't last forever. Keep going and look for the way out. It will come. Number 9, shake off the dust and move on. Remember the first guide dog command, forward. And number 10, when work is over, play hard with your friends, and don't forget to share your favorite bow to bone. Thank you all. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Michael.